Good evening. Well, as you'll know by now, Nicholas Ninow, the man known as the Dros Rapist, has been sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years. Ninow was convicted of raping a 7-year-old girl in the ladies' toilet of a restaurant in Pretoria. He had claimed in mitigation of sentence that a history of drug abuse and the fact that he was introduced to drugs by his mother at a young age had had a huge impact on his life. But today, the judge said that what happened would impact on his victim for the rest of her life. She would have to live with this, and that outweighed his arguments. To discuss the psychology of the case and the impact of what happened to his victim, we're joined in our studio now by Dr. Shahida Omar, the Director of Clinical Services at the Teddy Bear Clinic, and on the phone tonight, a forensic and clinical psychologist, Dr. Gaida Del Fabro. Thank you both very much indeed for being available tonight. Dr. Omar, let me just start with you. This young girl, she was 7 at the time, been through the kind of incident that no one should ever have to go through, goes without saying, at a very young age, the kind of trauma that no human being should ever have to go through. Where do you even start with treatment?
Well, you asked a very important question. I think just the fact that she was believed, she was supported by her family, she was supported by mental health professionals, and taken through this process. It's obvious that she would continue, and she would continue requiring therapeutic intervention by mental health professionals. And if we ask how long that process should be or will be, one cannot predict that. It could be forever, it could be lifelong, because you've beautifully articulated what the judge said. This imprint of this trauma, this heinous sexual offense that she was subjected to, it's not something that you can just erase, take a rubber and wipe it out of her life. Unfortunately, it's something that she has to live with. Therefore, ongoing support and counseling is essential and critical for this young girl.
For people who've been through trauma like this, there's often a difficulty in forming lasting and trusting relationships.
Indeed.
That's perhaps where the trauma sort of revisits itself. Is that likely to happen here?
Well, of course, one cannot predict, as I said, it's an unpredictable process or trajectory, but the issues of trust are lifelong. The implications of the inability to form intimate relationships, the barriers to intimacy, or even generalizing relationships, the trust issues will always linger. With therapy and intensive support, she may be able to learn to cope and deal with this.
Can humans deal with something like this?
Well, certainly not. I don't think any human being can live with something like this. To be plagued and to be subjected to this kind of horrific, traumatic experience is something that one can never come to terms with. As I said, it's not something that you can just wipe away and move on and say, now it's behind me, I'm done with it.
Dr. Del Fabro is a forensic psychologist, the person of Nicholas Ninow. I mean, is it possible to know at all what was going through his mind when this happened, when he did this?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very difficult to get a true sense. I mean, he has spoken about how he was under the influence of drugs when this happened, which may have reduced one of his inhibitions, but, as we know, an offense such as rape is really a crime of violence and anger and power. So one might hypothesize that there might have been a combination of events that made him feel quite disempowered, angry, and that provoked the offence that he did commit. But these feelings would all have been simmering at some level for many years before that. And I guess with his chronic drug use and using drugs on the day, it would have made him lose the inhibitions that might have put a check on him committing a similar offence in the past.
We heard during the sentencing proceedings that he himself had been abused, that he'd been sexually abused as a young boy. Could that have played a role in the fact that he's now abused someone else?
Well, we do know that often victims of abuse have a high probability of becoming abusers themselves. So, yeah, it is quite likely that it did play a part.
Dr. Omar, I mean, this comes back to the point. I mean, it is in 99.9% of cases male human beings who commit this abuse. This would suggest that Nicholas Ninow, when he was abused, did not get the kind of counselling and help that he would have needed.
Well, it could be. One is not certain about those facts, but along the process of the trial, there were opportunities for rehabilitation for his drug abuse. So, again, using the argument of the substances intoxicating him and the denial of awareness and the denial of responsibility doesn't gel, because he did what he did of his own volition. He took drugs, and that was out of his own choice. He had the power of choice, knowing fully well that he would not be in his full senses.
It's also very important that people take responsibility for their actions.
Indeed.
As a legal system in a society, it doesn't matter what happens to you if we don't have that.
Actions have consequences, and I think we clearly saw these actions that he took certainly resulted in something that destroyed not the life of this child only, but the whole family, and I think just the impact it's had on society as a whole.
Dr. Del Fabio, I mean, is there a risk sometimes that there can be a chain of abuse, that this can be repeated through generations? I mean, it may happen in families, it may have happened, may not have happened in this case. Is that something that we need to be very cognizant of?
We definitely do. I mean, I think that without sort of an intervention of sorts or a break in the chain, as described, there is definitely a high risk that will be perpetuated through generations, where certain kind of behavior is modeled, is seen as acceptable, certain kinds of violence and traumas are repeated as victims themselves reenact some of the abuse. So that definitely is something that needs to be looked at in crimes of these sorts, especially when there's an assessment that there is a perpetuation across previous generations.
How do you break that cycle? And I presume breaking that cycle involves a proper intervention. It involves, in all cases, proper parenting as well.
That's correct. I mean, I think you're looking at an intervention that is on multiple levels, quite a systemic intervention. I mean, it even goes as far as looking at interventions at a state level or kind of nationwide level, where we address our notions of gender violence and abuse. But that sort of filtering through the layers and the circles getting smaller, one would definitely have to start with interventions at the parenting level and then look at what the surrounding support structures are that either support the abuse or the toxic behavior, or are strengths that can be sort of leveraged to assist.
Dr. Omar, I mean, you're nodding your head quite furiously here. Just talk to me about what kind of interventions the state can make. We understand that families in South Africa are broken. We understand why. We understand the history of this migrant labour, etc. It goes back a very long way. What interventions can the state make then?
Well, I think certainly that every government department needs to come to the party here, whether it's health, it's labour, it's education, it's social development. There's programs, and I think if we're looking at intervention, it's early intervention, starting with children as young as 2 years old who have already developed some vocabulary and are in a position to talk. So we need to start engaging children. We need to start engaging them throughout their lifespan. But we also need to, when we talk about healthcare facilities for potential mothers, antenatal clinics, and ideal platform, you talked about positive parenting. We need to look at crime prevention at schools. We need to engage with young children at schools about safe, unsafe behaviors, actions having consequences. Irresponsible actions would result in, of course, unbearable situations and situations like this. So across the spectrum, as the learned forensic psychologist spoke to, it's a systemic intervention. Responsibility is not there or here. It's co-responsibility of both government and civil society.
There's been a lot of talk about whether Nicholas Ninow can be rehabilitated. We understand where he comes from. Do you believe that he can? He's going to be in jail for a long time with the right programs?
Well, even with the right programs, one cannot definitely guarantee that, because just from the evaluation and the assessment that came out, his inability to delay gratification, lack of impulse control, the lack of empathy and regard for others, those are key indicators of the lack of potential for rehabilitation. So, I would not place my bets on Nicholas Ninow's rehabilitation.
Dr. Del Fabio, you're on the phone, but I think I can hear you nodding. Am I hearing you nodding?
That is correct. Yes. I mean, I think the factors that Dr. Omar has underlined are key here. I mean, I think those are definitely very important aspects that one would look at in assessing the prognosis for rehabilitation. And if those aren't, sort of those boxes aren't being ticked, then it looks, the risk for reoffending is high, and the potential for rehabilitation is low. So I would definitely agree with what she said.
Dr. Delfaba, I mean, one of the things that we would want to do as a society is to make sure that something like this never happens again. And to do that, we would need to be able to identify potential offenders. Is it possible to do that? I mean, I don't know enough about Nicholas Ninow's previous history to know if anyone would have been able to make any kind of prediction that he would have done this. But is it possible for you as a forensic psychologist, Dr. Omar, with the experience she has, to be able to look at someone, to examine them and think, this person is capable and might one day hurt a child in this way?
I mean, I think the risk factors don't just suddenly appear. I mean, I think, unfortunately, for someone like Nicholas now, he probably slipped through the cracks, and I think a lot of individuals and offenders do, where you will see warning signs much earlier on in their life. You know, behavior which one would term risky, antisocial. So there would be perhaps in, for example, substance use, or, you know, that trait around not taking responsibility for one's actions, or inability to delay gratification. It would manifest in other behaviors as well, not just sexual ones necessarily. So, you know, you may have someone that's quite impulsive. Saying that we can't take it in isolation, it would be a sort of a cluster of the traits that have come through the trial, but that would definitely have been evident earlier on in his life, and perhaps in a different kind of environment with more supervision or more education around identifying those problematic behaviors or worrying signs. You know, he could have been earmarked and perhaps had an intervention earlier on, but without that, you know, he entered adulthood with those traits and features firmly in place, and a huge risk.
You, with On the Record, are talking about the psychology of the Nicholas Ninow case, the man who was convicted of raping a 7-year-old girl. Just to remind you this evening that as this broadcast goes out, President Cyril Ramaphosa is addressing ANC branches in eThekwini tonight. You can catch that speech on YouTube. You can go to sabcnews.com. Also, the SABC Now app. You'll be able to follow that speech. Here, we'll continue with our conversation around the Nicholas Ninow case for just the moment. Dr. Omar, there was a time, it seemed, when news bulletins broadcast like this would have stories around the rapes of young babies. Have we seen that the numbers of those cases of young children being attacked in the way that the 7-year-old girl was, have we seen those start to decrease?
Well, I cannot say that we've seen a decrease, a definite decrease. We've had spurts where we've seen quite a few babies, you know, a number of reports and incidences, but for the most recent time or recent period, we haven't had a recent report of that kind of occurrence or violation. We're seeing a lot more younger girls between the ages of 3, 4, 5, 6 and older who have been subjected to this kind of sexual abuse and rape.
What's happening in our society that leads to that?
Well, I think if we just look around, we are surrounded by violence. I mean, there's an explosion of violence. It's within the immediate internal confines of one's context. Children are exposed to interpersonal violence, domestic violence, and culture of violence outside. And even at school, 73% of violence is committed at school. So what are they learning? What are they learning in terms of resolving conflict and managing problems? They are role-playing what they've been exposed to, role modeling, identifying with their celebrity icons. When they switch on the TV, what do they see? The victorious is the perpetrator that gets away with using a gun or a knife. And we see this replaying in our schools. Children are just mimicking what they are subjected to.
Dr. Delfaba, is that your diagnosis as well, that we're seeing what we're seeing in the Ninow case because of what's happening in our society, because sometimes of what we see and hear?
I think it definitely plays a large role, and I think it filters through into, I mean, what you're speaking about also sort of the lack of resources around intervening at a parenting level, at a very early childhood level. So what you find is that in this culture that Dr. Omar has described, and taking it more inside the home, what we actually find the fundamentals of sort of attachment and bonding between children and their parents are not happening in the way that they should. And all those key factors, such as the capacity for empathy, you know, capacity to manage one's emotions in a constructive way, to not act out impulsively, you know, those skills that we learn through appropriate bonding with our parents, our caregivers, those aren't happening enough also, and I think that really plays a huge part here too.
Dr. Del Fabro, the fact that we have that many people have easy access to drugs, I'm thinking of Ninow and other mind-altering substances, that makes the whole situation much worse.
Definitely, because, I mean, in terms of a coping skill, even if you haven't sort of internalized constructive ways of dealing with your emotions, that becomes a very sort of quick pathway to managing them in a very destructive way. So it becomes very attractive.
Right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Shahida Omar, the Director of Clinical Services at the Teddy Bear Clinic. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. On the phone tonight, Dr. Gaida Del Fabro, a forensic psychologist. More on that, of course, through the evening.